es un arquitecto portugués. Es curador de arquitectura contemporánea en el Museo de Arte Moderno de Nueva York. Ha trabajado como arquitecto, profesor y escritor. Fue curador de Metaflux en la Bienal de Arquitectura de Venecia en el 2004, así como Post-Rotterdam, Space Invaders y Pancho Guedes, An Alternative Modernist. Es autor de los libros Interiores 01-010 y de Arquitectura en Público, ganador del premio FAT de Pensamiento y Crítica en 2012. Con ustedes, Pedro Gadanho.
Y bien, hola y muchas gracias a Miquel y a Andrea Giborio por traerme aquí en este grande festival sobre ciudad. Es la segunda vez que estoy en Ciudad de México y es una ciudad que me interesa mucho, como van a ver por el proyecto que he hecho ahora en Nueva York. Yo voy a hablar en inglés, les pido perdón, pero me siento un poco más confortable, pero algunas ideas tal vez las diga concretamente en español. Y así yo voy a hablar de cómo las exposiciones, de algún modo, pueden ser parte de un proceso que instiga la discusión sobre la ciudad, que empieza algo conectado con la ciudad, que se necesita tantísimo, como es obvio de esta presentación. Estoy también muy contento que, por accidente, Rafael Cárdenas ha hablado antes de mí, porque él es artista, pero en su trabajo de artista justamente utiliza su medio en cuanto artista para hablar de problemas sociales muy concretos. Y esto no ha sido siempre así. Hay momentos en que el arte se entiende como algo de autónomo, que no se quiere relacionar con el social para no influenciar su importancia, su propio modo de pensar. Pero hay otros momentos históricos en que tal vez la urgencia es tal que también los artistas, los arquitectos, los designers se quieren envolver con responder a los problemas que se sienten. Paso al inglés. This was my first challenge when I came to MoMA, when I had to work with a collection, an institutional collection that has mainly collected the masterworks of great architects along modernity. What would I do that in a way echoed some of the feelings that I sensed changing also in the world of architecture? I mean, when I arrived in New York, the curious thing was that Occupy Wall Street had just happened. And in blogs and in websites, architects were curiously asking themselves, what can we do to contribute to this debate? How can we discuss the city as people are spontaneously doing by invading public spaces? And actually, I did think that it was sort of a question that shouldn't be there. I mean, I understood why people put that question forward, because obviously architecture had become more and more of a technical service that served certain economical demands more than certain social demands. A long time, something that had been at the core of the modernist project, let's say, when social housing was a main issue for modernists in the 20s, the 30s, even after the Second World War, there was a social conscience for modern architects. But I think that sort of got lost. And that's why people, architects, were asking themselves again, how can we contribute to a political discussion? And actually, if you think of the word polis, de ciudad, of course, it's the same word that originates the idea or the notion of the political. So when you are intervening in the city, in the polis, you are inevitably having a political intervention in the city. But I think architects have forgotten about these, but now there are many and more that actually remember these and think about it and want to participate in another way in the processes that are shifting in terms of cities, in terms of the problems that we're facing in the next few decades. So what I did with this exhibition actually was sort of rereading the collection, going back to some projects and rereading them as political. And this is a simple gesture, but it certainly had an effect, because when you think about the work of Archigram, for instance, here, you tend to see Archigram dealing with consumer culture, with pop, in a sort of playful way. But you forget that their proposals for the city were actually very radical, and they were actually proposing to totally change the social organization of the city. So they were presenting a critical model on how we saw the city and how we could conceive the city. And so, of course, they made visionary projects that were not at all immediately feasible, but these were part of our discourse as architects. They became part of our thinking, of our culture. And it was maybe important to revisit those projects, just not just out of fashion, but because they had something unfulfilled that had yet to be introduced into reality. And I think this actually has happened through other projects. And this is just beginning to explain to you how, in a way, here, we were using the past to think about the present. Also, as in this case in which we thought of works from MoMA's collection about social responsibility of the architect. And actually, we had to go out there and collect some of these works because the collection was not oriented towards that kind of work, that kind of architectural project. So the projects that were shown in this wall about the social responsibility of the architect were actually one that has been mentioned today here, the Medellin Library by Giancarlo Mazzanti. There were works by Álvaro Siza in the revolutionary period in Portugal, right after 1974, in which social housing became a political and social issue for architects, and even other recent projects by artists come architects that have been using this blurring of boundaries between art and architecture to actually do critical projects on the current state of the city and society, like Didier Fusa Faustino from Paris. So in a way, we had to change the collection to be able also to represent what was happening right now or over the last decades that could represent a political intention when it comes to social responsibility. So obviously, this idea works as a sort of preamble or an introduction to an exhibition that we did later that I want to present here with more detail, which is, of course, not looking at the past, but actually using the present as a trigger to think about the future. And here, the future is a future that is all about disasters, emergencies, catastrophic problems that we are already sort of glimpsing, we are already sort of thinking about, but that we haven't really integrated into our practices. Actually, this exhibition that I'm going to talk about was part of a series that had started precisely with climatic change. How will the rising sea levels affect our cities, the design of our cities? How do we have to start thinking about the city that reacts to climatic change? In this case, in rising currents. Then there was a second exhibition that actually addressed the problem that Saskia Sassen mentioned here today, which was the problems of foreclosures in the United States. So 5 cities were chosen in the States that actually had this huge problem of houses being taken by banks from the people who were paying for them because of the economical crisis in 2008, and taking these as an opportunity to think about the model of the American suburb. Was it sustainable? Was it something that we wanted to prolong? Or would we have other visions for the city regarding housing problems that we were experiencing. For me, when I was challenged to do the third exhibition in this series, obviously I thought that not only there were problems of density that we are addressing in this conference, the overpopulation, the fact that we are living in cities more and more, that since 2008 had already inspired me to think about cities and to want to do something about cities, but then to also think about a problem that is not so often mentioned when we talk about these dramatic numbers, which is the fact that within this growth in cities around the world, in average, the urban population, 2/3 of the urban population will be poor. That is, conditions in cities will be worse than now. And we know how bad they are now in certain cities. In other cities, maybe inequality is a little bit more invisible. But actually, we can discover that even in New York, you have huge problems of inequality that obviously affect the way we live democratically in a city. And that leads precisely to the kind of political protests that we have seen not only in the Occupy Wall Street movement, but in Brazil recently, or in Istanbul. So I thought that equally as catastrophic as the climatic change was the fact that, inequality was growing. And I must say something to clarify these. I think Saskia Sassen touched very quickly upon it. But what we tend to forget was that coming to the city was, during the 20th century, a dream. It represented the possibility of getting a better life. And I think this was true up till very recently. This is still true in many cities. I think in cities in Latin America, like here in Ciudad de Mexico, like in São Paulo, like in other cities in South America, we are still talking about a dream to come to the city so that actually you get a better life, you get a better economical condition. But it's also true that, as Saskia mentioned, people are being expelled from the countryside. They sometimes do not come to the city because they need to, or they think they will find a better life here, but because the countryside itself is being taken from them. And so they have to move. And I think we are at a tipping point in most cities in which actually those people are not getting a better life because they enter poverty cycles from which they actually cannot escape, precisely because of what Rafael just mentioned. This kind of cycle in which you have no education, you have crime, you have no mobility, and you cannot escape that poverty cycle. This has been studied in Africa, in Latin America, in other places. And so I think there is more of a need for many more people in different areas to address these questions. And so I thought that, okay, let's take these as the possibility of a catastrophe, and let's start thinking about it now. And of course, there have been many people that have been studying this densification of cities. There has been like a good 15 years of books, exhibitions, research projects that have dealt with the idea of the city. I mean, Enrique Burdett, who is talking here tomorrow, did the Venice Biennial precisely on these problems. But it was all about data. It was all about a phase of collecting information about what was happening. But no proposals were actually being created except from a sort of bottom-up source. I mean, there were people doing things that addressed directly these problems. But this was not part of initiatives where you demanded architects to really address this question. And this is the challenge that we sort of gave ourselves at the museum. Even if the museum is no university, is no city council, is no state authority, and therefore we are not entitled to offer solutions for the problem, which actually I don't believe exist at this moment. We as a museum could go back to this tradition of producing architectural visions that would show us at least a possibility of discussion. And I think the show that we proposed has been polemical enough to precisely generate that kind of discussion. That discussion obviously involves this polemical idea that the informal is there and that master planning is not fast enough or has the economical capacity to actually face these problems. We know that at the beginning of the 20th century, Europe and the States have managed to eradicate slums. But will our countries now in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, will they be able to eradicate slums at the speed that they are growing? Mike Davis, for example, says, no, this is becoming a planet of slums. But I believe we have to be optimistical and at least try to think of how to address these. And as architects, designers, artists, maybe we have to really take it into our hands, as people do in the streets, to consider these problems again. And not in the same way, for sure, that modernist architects did with the Carta de Atenas, with ideas of eradicating the city and substituting it for these slabs, which have proven to be also mistakes. So what we have now currently in many cities around the world, in many situations, is this, again, going back to what has been said this morning, this this boundary situation in which actually the so-called traditional city lives very close and in very close tension with the presence of these immense informal occupations. And so, again, for me, the question was, how can this state of emergency actually inspire new ways of thinking? How can we be creative about these matters? How can we respond in different manners? Not by responding with our traditional project, but how can we create these moments in which change may actually happen? Because the visions are so different, even if they start at a small scale, they can introduce some change. I think examples like Medellin precisely point to that possibility. But also, in the work of designers recently, as also artists, we see that the fact that technology is more and more available at very large scales maybe can help transform things. Maybe social media can help transform things. But also maybe other ways of thinking how technology is used by people in a sort of lo-fi way. Not hi-fi, not high-tech, but actually in sort of shared networks of li-fi objects, like hacking, as proven, can transform everyday objects into other things. And of course, assuming this responsibility, this social responsibility. And I think there have been also architects that have engaged with this idea that they can learn from the informal and bring those models that sometimes are much more sustainable if we look at them closely and think how could they influence the way we design formally. I think Teddy Cruz is a good example, precisely using the border between San Diego and Tijuana to ask him to produce the question of, can we learn from Tijuana? Can we learn from informal settlements in Lagos or in Mumbai? And this made me believe that to deal with the question of what we've called uneven growth, maybe tactical urbanisms could be an inspiration, not the solution, not the model to follow very closely, but an inspiration, a trigger to think of other possibilities of combining what we call bottom-up actions, actions that, as Rafael has mentioned here, involve the population, participatory processes, emerge from very particular needs locally and combine those ideas, those impulses, with still, obviously, a necessity to have a role from the government to provide infrastructure, large-scale investment. The question is not only one or not only the other, but how do we combine these two? And I think there are governments, like in Medellin, like in other places that have instituted participatory budgets and so on, that have understood that they cannot resist, actually, this sort of logic of combining bottom-up impulses with top-down policy. And this is what the exhibition was about and wanted to be about. So, as in the previous exhibitions, what we did was getting participants together in workshops so that they could discuss, debate, try to think about what could be their approach to this brief. How can you use the inspiration of tactical urbanism? Tactical urbanism, let me say, is much what, again, Torolab was doing. Is intervening at small scale, is connecting different agents and starting processes that are local, but that can be scalable to other areas of the city. They are starting there, but they can become a norm for other moments. And so we brought these people together from all over the planet to study 6 cities along these workshops. We invited people like David Harvey, like Saskia, like Ricky Burdett, like Teddy Cruz, to think about this question, to think about what is this near future of the city, and produced a book with small essays, but that instigate reflection and discussion. And finally, we produced the exhibition in a museum that has 3 million visitors a year, 10,000 people a day in average. And this was my goal, ultimately, was to use the platform of the museum as a sort of media exposure that affects many more people than any discourse in academia could ever reach. Even these, I mean, we have 2,000 people here. There's television, there's radio. But will you reach 3 million people? It's important that you do, because the discussion is, as I said, a discussion about a state of emergency. And so this is about using the museum as any other medium to actually trigger the discussion and the debate, to make more people aware that these problems are coming. And so, for example, the exhibition started precisely by comparing 6 cities that we chose as case studies. And I have to say that people always ask, why these 6 cities in particular? You would ask, why not Ciudad de Mexico? It's obviously a city that would be very indicated for this problem, to study this problem. But my question was that I wanted to show different degrees, different moments in which several cities are in regards to the problem of inequality. Some are at a very moment in which big problems are still there, with slums very present and so on. And others, like New York or Hong Kong, are very advanced in the way they express inequality in their own, let's say, tissue. So the reason why we chose these 6 cities was to first represent the 6 continents around the world, 6 world regions with different kinds of problems, 6 different moments in history, in the history of inequality, and cities that showed social conflict or social tension in different manners. And the reason I chose, for instance, for Latin America, Rio, was because Rio has the favelas, the slums, in the center of the city. It's not like a problem that is outside that you can sort of forget in your daily life, but it's a problem that is there. And the Olympics were coming, the World Championship of Football was coming, and so the city was undergoing a number of processes in terms of what they intended, how they intended to change the city. So it was a good moment to choose that city, per contrast with São Paulo or Ciudad de Mexico, that had been actually very studied over these 15 years in these initiatives that took place in different contexts. So for us, it made sense to choose Rio, as it made sense to choose Istanbul in Europe. Why? Because Istanbul is one of the fast-growing cities in Istanbul, and if Paris or London are similar to New York, Istanbul represents a totally different condition of a place where the middle classes are still growing, as here or in Rio, and in which maybe governments are making the same mistakes that the United States or Europe made right after the war in the way they dealt with the city, with monofunctional areas for inhabitation, with these mixed uses that Richard Sennett spoke about today. And Lagos, of course, represented Africa and a state in which some of these problems are, for us, even here in Latin America, in Asia, almost unbelievable. I mean, situations of contrast that are truly violent and difficult to face, cycles of poverty that are truly, truly dangerous, let's say, even to a balance in a world in which now we cannot contain our frontiers. We are interdependent of each nation, of each area, and the way it develops. Hong Kong, for me, became almost like the surprise. And I'll start by there. I'll come to it. But as a city that is very dense, it is one of the most futuristic cities in the world in terms of anticipating these problems. It is, I would say, even more futuristic than New York. And in that sense, it may be that's the reason why it turned into a sort of science fiction exercise within the exhibition. But we did want this diversity of results and approaches. So again, as I said, to trigger the discussion rather than to offer solutions. So this is the proposal for Mumbai. I will go now in the 10 or 12 minutes that I have left, just briefly explain what the solutions are. I'm not going into too much detail, but I want to show you how diverse these groups had an approach to this problem, to this brief, let's say, that the curator set for the program of the exhibition. And I must say that in every city, for me, it was very important to consider that there was a local group that knew the reality fairly well, and there was an external research group that brought a broader vision from centers where urban discussions are taking place for a number of years now. So this combination, that's certainly led sometimes into conflict, discussions, very different positions, was for me very important to, again, make a combination of local knowledge with, let's say, global knowledge. And what you see here is actually a sort of idea that I see inspired not only in this idea of tactical urbanisms, as when populations occupy Torre David, in which there is just a minimum infrastructure that people appropriate and take as their own in Venezuela and Caracas. So it's like a big infrastructure that enters the city and contrasts this traditional modern idea that, you know, Dharavi, which is a 1 million people slum, let's call it, in Mumbai, in India, that instead of it being raised to give place to towers or to give away the pressure, the economical pressure to restructure this central area of the city into traditional city, let's think that we could offer just minimal infrastructure that people could occupy, like a carpet that would float above the existing so that people slowly would grow organically through these structures, like you offer a tree pole, a support for the tree to grow. And so this is obviously a science fiction idea. This is obviously not doable over the next 10 years. But there is actually the technology. This combined this local group with a group that does research in the MIT precisely about these mega infrastructural buildings, which are not buildings. They are just platforms. They are just elements that integrate the existing city. And you could go back and understand that this has references in our architectural tradition and culture. Yona Friedman was proposing these sort of ideas of informal dissemination through the city. So it's been something that people have been thinking since at least the 70s. And again, it is polemical, and it has originated, obviously, a lot of discussion. Maybe it doesn't respond to all the problems that exist in Mumbai, but these are so complex that obviously require not only a small team of 10 or 12 people. They require the city authorities, they require governments, they require architects, social scientists, artists, and so on and so on. As I said before, Hong Kong had the most advanced proposal in terms of idea. I think of it as a critical proposal that represents a reaction, a political reaction actually, to the idea that the Chinese government wants to have population growth in Hong Kong, a big population growth over the next 10 to 20 years. And if you know Hong Kong, you'll know that it's an island, it's already super dense. How can you make a city that is already so dense grow? And this conjunction of a local office, map office, with a lab in Colombia, they came up with the idea of proposing artificial islands, which are not to be taken at very direct value, although Chinese government is actually creating artificial islands so as to claim sea around their land. But actually it was a sort of political statement, a fiction, that was, I would say, inspired by Super Studio in the way of using an idea that is so extreme that really makes us think about what is the solution. This is not a solution, doing artificial islands. Or maybe if you think about a science fiction world in 50, 70 years ahead, maybe it's actually what is going to happen. But let's say it's only a fiction, a friction to provoke thought. In the case of New York, people, the teams invited to participate, and which for me, in their diversity, represent possibilities of future practice for architecture, they just responded to a very, very specific problem. You know, there is a huge need for housing, affordable housing in New York. Although New York seems so much of an advanced city with, you know, resources for all, with a better quality of life for all, what they did in their research was to discover that there was a sort of invisible slum in New York. Although the city formally looks like the traditional city, if you go inside the houses in Queens, you actually have them subdivided, inhabited by 30, 40 people, immigrants that are coming into the city. So there is, as in the Lower East Side 100 years ago, there is an invisible slum in New York. And this is what they made. They made it visible. They showed maps in which you see the illegal conversions, and you show that there is an inequality in New York. And we know these. Mayor Bloomberg said very proudly, of course there is inequality in New York because we have 500,000 millionaires. So these people are so rich that obviously there is a gap in between one part of the population and the other. But I think it's a little bit more perverse than that. And so they actually engage with people, activists, to discuss social policies, housing policies, and they tried to present two models. And I must say that it was very interesting because the local group, City Studio from Brooklyn, and Costra, who integrates Miguel Robles Duran, which I believe is from Mexico, they had such different ideological positions that they came back with two different solutions for the problem, which I accepted because I think that reveals that there are very different ideas out there. But they will eventually have to come together, as Chantal Mouffe defends, and this idea of agonism, of political agonism, that different conflicting positions will have to come together if we want to solve the problem. So I was not worried that they showed contradiction or problems or conflicts. I think this is part of life. And it's part also of the way in which we'll have to deal with the city. In Lagos, what we had, which I think is very revealing to some, responding to some of the actions that have also emerged a lot in Latin America over the last years, was that we had the so-called collective Inteligencias Colectivas from Madrid, a collective of very, very young architects that, as their usual practice, studies creativity that comes out of the streets, that people do in the streets, and then they turn them into design prototypes. And they applied this method to Lagos. They went to Lagos, they saw what was coming out in the streets, and they transformed them in design prototypes that could be part of a future vision of the city. With obviously a local architect, Malay architects, that have already over the last 2-3 years had been very recognized by some illegal school that they had done in the worst slum of Lagos over the water. So what they had to imagine was, could this ever become a Venice? And it sounds like almost a joke, but Venice, think about it. Maybe 500 years ago, it would look like a slum. But it has evolved organically until it has become the beautiful city that we know. And this is what I believe will happen to the current slums. If we do not eradicate because we don't have the capacity, they will grow into an organic city that is productive, that is lively, that has a capacity for survival. Rio, finally, or before Istanbul, was another solution that came that was very interesting. Being that the middle classes are growing, that many more people are coming out of poverty, the architects involved thought, maybe we have to have a different approach. Let's think that if people, when they ascend in terms of middle class, they become consumers, they want to express themselves through consumption, maybe we can give them objects, ways of using and improving the city that they can use for themselves while expressing their identity, while being empowered to take hold of the public space or even improving their houses. So what they made was a catalog of ideas and products that people could be buying from a website. All of this is fictional. All of this is ironic. But maybe irony, maybe humor has also to be part of the discussion, so that you really think of different ways, of the out-of-the-box ways to address these problems. And finally, in Istanbul, something that I was being reminded while Raphael was talking, the fact that these housing projects that the government has suggested and is still doing now in Istanbul to respond to social housing or middle-class housing needs, is very similar to what has been produced in the banlieue de Paris, in the suburbs of Paris that have become hotbeds of conflict, of racial and social tension, which have not worked as intended, which are monofunctional. People live there and they travel 2 hours to go to work. And these places are not productive. And what they thought was these communities would have to be given again the notion that they can do something about their neighborhood, that they could plant a garden, they could exchange services, they could have a local economy in which actually social media can help people to feel engaged. Because as Raphael said, it's very difficult to have participatory processes in this sense. And we do need to engage people to understand that they can do something about their own lives, even if we believe that government has to also play their part. And I agree with Raphael, not with assistencialismo, but with engaging with these processes. And again, I think designers are there to conceive these processes, to design the interfaces, to help people, to do workshops with people, to teach them how to do things. And this is maybe where this conjunction of our discipline, our tradition, our tools can be combined with needs that will become more and more present. And this is also why we thought that the project couldn't stop there, and there would have to be some sort of platform in which other people, other than the participants that we've chosen, could be engaged into the discussion. And this is why we created a website that is not very traditional. It's not like your usual description of the contents of the exhibition, although it has that as well. but it's rather a platform like Instagram or Tumblr in which people can submit their own ideas. So this is a platform that is ongoing, that stays on as long as the museum wants to have it. It has already 200 submissions from around the world, but I think that's not enough. I think there is a lot of work that has been happening in Latin America that is relevant, that should be there. And that I want to say here will be actually exhibited in the Vienna Biennial, the new arts and architecture biennial, in which uneven growth will be shown. So if you put your work there, I'm talking about you young architects that have just started doing something very small in your neighborhood, put it there and it will be shown in Vienna. And it's not because it will be shown, it's because it will become part of the discussion. And I think this is probably one of the most important legacies, let's say, of the exhibition, is that it can continue with grow with a participatory process of those who are actually doing things to change the reality that we've shown here. I know that this truck is around there somewhere, Productora for Alumnos 47. For me, it's a good example of a project that should be there to demonstrate that there is a different way to understand how architecture intervenes in regards to urban problems of the moment and inequality in the city. When this truck goes to a neighborhood and kids have access to books, they start to be engaged with the idea of education. And even if for a week, there is something that changes. So this is an example of tactical urbanism, of that tactical urbanism that can have very different forms in very different places. But it's certainly part of the mix that will be needed if we want to address the problem. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. A continuación, dentro de 5 minutos, iniciaremos con la siguiente conferencia con Ricardo Flores.
¿Pasé mucho tiempo o no?
Un anuncio
1 o 2
importante.
minutos.
Como parte de las actividades